Between 1450 and 1750, the world map was completely redrawn. European ships, for the first time, crossed these vast oceans, connecting continents in a way that had never happened before. But listen, this new global network, it wasn't built on friendly handshakes. It was forged in the fire of ambition, intense rivalry, and brutal exploitation. So today, we're diving into this transformative and pretty turbulent era of maritime empires.
This song, it comes from a West African storyteller, a griot, and it just perfectly captures the heart of our story today. It's this profound lament for a world that's been turned completely upside down, a world where freedom itself was just seized. It's this deep sense of loss that really echoes through this entire period.
So that brings us right to the big question we're going to tackle. How did this even happen? What was pushing these nations out to sea? And once they got where they were going, what kind of systems did they set up to pull out wealth and build these globe-spanning empires?
It really all kicked off with a race. And I'm not just talking about a race for land. This was a race for power, for wealth, and, in their eyes, for souls. This was no casual exploration. It was a desperate, fiercely competitive sprint to claim a piece of the world.
Okay, so what was the fuel for this massive race? Well, historians usually boil it down to three things: gold, God, and glory. See, Europe back then was this patchwork of ambitious, competing kingdoms, Spain, Portugal, France, England, and they were all looking for an edge over their rivals. An overseas empire, that was the ultimate status symbol. That's your glory. Then there was a real, genuine religious drive to spread Christianity. That's the God part. But the main engine, the thing that really made the whole enterprise go, it was economic. It was the gold. Europeans were desperate for a direct pipeline to the riches of Asia and Africa, cutting out all the old middlemen to get that spice, silk, and gold for themselves. So once they were out there on the open oceans, Europeans didn't really have a one-size-fits-all approach to building an empire. Their methods were totally shaped by the places they landed and the people they ran into. And this led to two very, very different models of imperial control.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. On one hand, you have the Americas. Here, European diseases absolutely devastated the local populations, which made it possible for them to go for full-scale conquest. They set up colonies, installed brand new governments, and were all about controlling the land and sucking out its resources. But on the other hand, in Africa and Asia, it was a totally different story. There, they faced powerful, established states and dense populations. So the approach was different. They built these networks of armed trading posts, kind of like forts, to control key ports and dominate trade routes, whether it was spices from Indonesia or textiles from India. And they did it through this messy mix of military force and some pretty uneasy alliances with the local rulers.
This map, wow, it really visualizes the strategy for the Americas perfectly. The Treaty of Tordesillas, think about this. Spain and Portugal literally drew a line on the map and split the entire New World between them. This wasn't about negotiating trade. It was about claiming ownership. And that mindset, it led directly to guys like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, completely toppling the massive Aztec and Inca empires, seizing their land, their people, and all of their wealth. Now, the trading post model was a whole different ballgame. The Portuguese, with their cannon-armed ships, they didn't try to conquer whole continents. Instead, they seized strategic choke points. They took over vital trading hubs in the Indian Ocean and all along the Swahili coast of Africa. And in West Africa, they started trading guns with powerful kingdoms like Dahomey, who then used that new firepower to capture people from rival groups, people who were then sold into the burgeoning slave trade. So this model created this really complex and often tragic web of dependence and conflict, where some local states got more powerful while others were absolutely devastated. And you have to remember, this competition wasn't just between Europeans and the local populations. The European powers were constantly fighting each other. This map here shows the overlapping claims of the French, the British, and the Dutch in North America. And that same rivalry played out all across the globe. But it's also super important to note that not everyone just rolled over. For centuries, powerful states like Ming China and Tokugawa Japan successfully kept the Europeans at arm's length, choosing to remain mostly isolated from their influence. But how did they pay for all of this? An empire is expensive. It costs a lot of money. To finance these huge overseas adventures, European states came up with a new economic philosophy, a machine designed to do one thing and one thing only: make the home country filthy rich.
And that philosophy was called mercantilism. The whole idea was actually pretty simple. A nation's power was measured by how much gold and silver it had stacked up in its vaults. And the absolute best way to get more gold and silver was to sell way more stuff than you buy. And colonies? Well, they were the secret sauce that made the whole system work.
This chart breaks down the cycle perfectly. Step 1, go grab a colony. Step 2, force them to produce cheap raw materials, things like sugar, tobacco, and tons of silver. Step 3, ship all that good stuff back home. Step 4, use it to manufacture finished goods like cloth or furniture. And here's the kicker. Step 5, sell those expensive goods right back to the people in the colonies, who, by the way, are forbidden from buying them from anyone else. It's a closed-loop system designed for maximum profit for the mother country, and it planted some serious seeds of resentment in the colonies. And the fuel for this whole global machine? Silver. An absolute flood of it, pouring out of massive mines in places like Potosi and modern-day Bolivia. This was the literal financial lifeblood of the Spanish Empire. In fact, so much silver flooded the global economy that it actually caused one of the world's first major inflationary crises, tanking the value of currency from Spain all the way to Ming China.
So the mercantilist machine was designed. The resources were located. But a huge question remained. Who was going to dig all that silver out of a mountain? Who was going to be out there cutting sugarcane under a blazing tropical sun? Who was going to do the brutal, back-breaking labor that made the whole thing profitable? And the answer to that question? Well, it reveals the dark, rotten foundation upon which these empires were built. The immense profits of mercantilism were squeezed out through the suffering of millions and millions of people, forced to work under horrifying systems of coerced labor.
Now, forcing people to work wasn't an entirely new idea. As this chart shows, systems like serfdom, where peasants were legally tied to the land they worked, had been around for centuries in Europe. But the labor systems that fueled these new maritime empires, they were different. They were on a whole other level in their scale, their racialized nature, and their brutal global reach.
So in the Americas, the Spanish first turned to the indigenous populations. They set up the encomienda system, which was basically a grant of native people to a Spanish landowner, a system that became notorious for its extreme brutality. They also took a traditional Incan system called the mita, which was originally a form of community public service, and they twisted it into a forced labor draft that sent thousands of men to their deaths in the dangerous silver mines.
But as disease and abuse just wiped out the indigenous populations, the Europeans turned to Africa for labor. And this led to something profoundly and horrifyingly different from other forms of bondage. Under chattel slavery, a human being was legally redefined as property, as chattel, with no more rights or personhood than a piece of cargo or farm animal.
This image, it's hard to look at, I know, but it is so essential. It strips away all the economic theories and the big numbers, and it shows you the human reality. Millions of Africans were captured, torn from their homes and families, and marched for weeks, sometimes months, to these coastal slave castles to await the terrifying journey across the Atlantic.
And where did they go? This chart shows the absolutely staggering scale of it all. Just look at these numbers. The vast majority were sent to the brutal sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean. Almost 40% went to Portuguese colonies alone. The demand for labor on these plantations was just insatiable. And that's not even counting the journey itself. The journey, known as the Middle Passage, was an absolute nightmare of disease, starvation, and unimaginable cruelty. Captives were packed shoulder to shoulder into the dark, filthy holds of ships for weeks on end. This number here, 10 to 15%, that represents millions of people who never even made it to the Americas, their lives just lost to the unforgiving Atlantic Ocean.
The creation of these empires and the labor systems that fed them didn't just change economies. It fundamentally and permanently remade the entire world, leaving behind legacies that, frankly, we're still grappling with today.
The consequences were planetary in scale. In the Americas, you had a demographic catastrophe as European diseases wiped out up to 90% of the indigenous population in some areas. In Africa, the slave trade led to severe depopulation and shattered societies. And all across the colonies, brand new social hierarchies were invented, with race being the main way to determine who had power and who didn't. And yet, out of all this tragedy, new cultures were also born, a blending of European, African, and indigenous traditions, foods, and languages that literally remade the world.
So what's the big takeaway here? This era connected the globe. It created the first truly worldwide economy. But we have to understand that this connection came at an almost unimaginable human cost. It established these deep patterns of wealth and power, of exploitation and inequality that didn't just vanish when the empires collapsed. And that leaves us with a final question to really think about. How do the echoes of these maritime empires still shape the borders, the economies, and the societies we all live in right now, today?